Before you fall asleep tonight, let me take you back to a time when being born a woman meant a life of quiet suffering, hidden strength, and survival against a brutal world. This is the untold story of medieval women. Night settles gently over a medieval town. There is no sudden darkness, no sharp silence, only the slow fading of light as oil lamps flicker behind wooden shutters, and the final sounds of the day dissolve into the cool evening air. Somewhere between the stone walls and narrow paths, a woman moves quietly. Her name does not matter. History did not record it. She is not a queen. She is not a saint. She is not remembered. She is simply a woman of the Middle Ages. She walks carefully, as she has been taught to do since childhood, not drawing attention, not taking up space, not speaking unless spoken to. In this world, silence is safety. The town around her feels permanent. Heavy stone buildings, timber beams darkened by age, church bells that mark the hours of prayer, work, and rest. But for her, nothing is permanent. Not her home, not her body, not even her future. From the moment she was born, her life followed a path already drawn by others. Before she could speak, decisions were made. Before she could understand, promises were arranged. Before she could choose, a role was assigned. She belongs to a world that was not built with her voice in mind. In medieval Europe, life moved slowly. Days followed the sun. Seasons ruled survival. Time was measured not by clocks, but by labor. And women existed within this rhythm. Quietly, their lives unfolded indoors, in shadows, behind walls. While history celebrated kings, wars, and conquests, women remained unnamed in the background. They were daughters, wives, mothers, rarely anything more. From an early age, a girl learned what was expected of her. Not through lessons or books, but through observation. She watched her mother rise before dawn. She watched her bend over hearth and field. She watched her endure pain without complaint. There were no speeches about destiny, no discussions of dreams. Only repetition, the same movements, the same duties, the same quiet obedience. This was how knowledge was passed down, not written, but lived. A medieval woman's body was not considered her own. It was seen as something temporary, something useful, something to be exchanged, guarded, or controlled. Her value was measured in practical terms. Could she work? Could she produce heirs? Could she strengthen a family alliance? Love was not part of the equation. Choice was not expected. From the outside, the town appeared calm, orderly, God-fearing. But beneath the surface, fear shaped everyday life. Fear of hunger, fear of disease, fear of divine punishment. And for women, fear of vulnerability. A woman was always exposed. Her safety depended on her father, then her husband, then her sons. If those protections failed, she stood alone in a harsh world that offered little mercy. Religion filled every corner of medieval life. Church bells dictated the hours. Scripture shaped morality. Sin was believed to lurk in every shadow, and women were often taught that they were closer to sin than men. Not openly accused, but quietly reminded. Their bodies were seen as weak, their minds as easily influenced. their presence as potentially dangerous. This belief did not always come with cruelty. More often, it came with calm certainty, a certainty that the natural order demanded submission. And so, women learned to lower their eyes, to soften their voices, to make themselves smaller, not because they wanted to, but because survival required it. At night, when the town finally rested, a medieval woman found brief moments of stillness. The hearth dimmed, children slept, tools lay untouched. These moments were rare. And precious. In the quiet, thoughts could drift freely. For a while, questions surfaced. What might life have been like? Elsewhere? In another body? Another time? But such thoughts were dangerous. Hope could make suffering heavier. So she learned to let those thoughts fade. Like breath on cold air. From our modern perspective, this world feels distant. But for her, it was all she knew. She did not imagine rebellion. She did not dream of escape. She focused on endurance. Each day survived was an achievement. Each winter endured was a victory. Strength, for her, did not come in loud gestures. It lived in quiet persistence. In continuing. Even when unseen. History often speaks in numbers. Wars won. Kingdoms lost. Years passed. But it rarely pauses to describe the weight of ordinary lives. The woman walking through the medieval town leaves no trace. No monument will mark her existence. No document will preserve her voice. Yet she carried the world forward in her own way. Through labor, through childbirth, through survival. Her suffering was not dramatic. It was constant. And because it was constant, it became invisible. As the night deepens, the town grows still. The woman returns to her home. A small, dim space shared with many. She lies down, fully clothed, ready to rise again before sunrise. Tomorrow will bring the same tasks, the same expectations, the same silence. She does not resist. She rests. Because rest is all the freedom she is allowed. This is where her story begins. Not with rebellion, not with tragedy, but with acceptance. A quiet, steady endurance that defined the lives of millions of women in the medieval world. Women who lived without recognition, without protection, without choice. And yet, they lived. In the chapters ahead, we will move slowly through their world, their childhood, their marriages, their labor, their fears, not to judge them, not to shock, but to understand what life truly meant for women in an age that was never built to hear their voices. Long before a medieval woman learned to walk, the world had already placed a weight upon her. It began at birth. Or, in many cases, even before. In medieval households, pregnancy was surrounded by uncertainty. There were no doctors waiting, no guarantees of survival. When labor began, women gathered quietly. They whispered prayers. They prepared cloth and warm water. And they waited. If a boy was born, relief followed. Sometimes joy. If a girl was born, the reaction was quieter. Not cruel, not openly disappointed. Simply restrained. A daughter meant another mouth to feed, another future dowry to prepare, another life that would eventually belong to another household. From her first breath, a girl existed within calculation. Infant mortality was common in the medieval world. Many children never reached their first birthday. Disease moved freely. Hunger followed poor harvests. But even in survival, differences appeared. Boys were often given more food, more care, more attention. Girls were expected to be resilient. Their strength was assumed, not protected. If resources were scarce, decisions were made quietly. A little less milk, a little less warmth, not out of hatred, out of necessity, shaped by tradition. As a young girl grew, her education did not involve books. Most women would never learn to read. Knowledge passed through hands, not words. She learned by watching how to grind grain, how to carry water without spilling, how to stay silent when adults spoke. Her world was small but demanding. Mistakes were not gently corrected. They had consequences. A spilled pot, a torn garment, a moment of disobedience. Each error carried weight, not because she was cruelly judged, but because survival allowed little margin for failure. Childhood, as we imagine it today, did not exist. A girl was useful as soon as she was able. By the age of 5 or 6, she was already helping. By 7 or 8, she was trusted with real responsibility. There was no ceremony marking the end of innocence, only increasing expectations. She woke early. She slept lightly. Her body adapted to work. Before it fully grew, emotion was not something she was encouraged to express. Crying did not change circumstances. Complaints brought punishment. So she learned restraint. To endure discomfort, to hide fear, to remain calm. These traits were praised. A good girl was quiet, obedient, useful. And so, from a young age, she understood her place. Not through explanation. Through repetition. In noble households, the experience was different, but not necessarily easier. Girls born into wealth were raised for marriage. Their bodies were guarded carefully. Their movements watched. They learned manners instead of chores, etiquette instead of labor. But freedom was still absent. Every gesture mattered. Every interaction was measured. Their futures were negotiated by men they might never meet. A girl could grow up surrounded by luxury, yet remain powerless. In peasant families, survival shaped everything. Food was simple. Shelter was fragile. Girls worked alongside mothers and sisters, often in the same fields as men, yet their labor was rarely recognized. What they produced belonged to the household, not to them. Their effort disappeared into necessity. As she grew older, her body changed, and with that change came new danger. A young girl's visibility increased. Eyes followed her more closely. Rules tightened. She was taught caution, where to walk, when to speak, who to avoid. Blame always found its way back to her. If something went wrong, it was because she had been careless, because she had drawn attention. Responsibility arrived early. Protection was uncertain. Medical knowledge was limited. Illness was interpreted as fate or punishment. A girl learned to endure pain quietly. There were no explanations. No comfort beyond prayer. Survival depended on the strength of her body and the mercy of circumstances. Despite this, moments of warmth existed. Shared laughter with siblings. Stories whispered by the hearth. Brief joy during festivals. But even these moments were temporary. Life did not pause, and she knew, deep down, that something awaited her. Marriage It was not spoken of as a choice, it was spoken of as destiny. From early childhood, hints appeared, comments from relatives, casual remarks. She will make a good wife. She is strong. She will be ready soon. Soon did not mean emotionally, It meant physically. Her body marked time, not her mind, as adolescence approached. Her world narrowed. Expectations solidified. She was no longer just a daughter. She was a future bride. Her value increased. And with it, control tightened. Her childhood faded without ceremony. For medieval girls, life was a preparation, not for happiness, but for endurance. They were raised to give, to obey, to continue. By the time she reached womanhood, she had already learned how to survive a world that demanded much and offered little in return. This was the beginning. Life shaped before it was lived. In the next chapter, we will move closer to the moment when childhood truly ends, not with celebration, but with a union decided by others, a marriage that would define the rest of her life. In the medieval world, childhood was brief. For girls, it often felt like it barely existed at all. There was no clear moment when childhood ended. No celebration. No gentle transition. Instead, responsibility arrived quietly and stayed. From an early age, a medieval girl learned that the world did not pause for her youth. Each day carried expectations. She woke with the light. Sometimes before it, her hands were small, but they were expected to work. The home was her first place of labor, sweeping dirt floors, fetching water from distant wells, keeping fires alive through cold mornings. These tasks were not given as lessons. They were simply required. If she asked why, there was no answer. This was how life had always been. Outside the home, danger waited patiently. Villages were not safe places for children. Animals wandered freely. Tools lay uncovered. Illness spread without warning. There were no laws designed to protect the young. A girl learned awareness early. Where to step, when to be quiet, how to avoid trouble. Mistakes could be costly. Family was meant to offer protection. But even within the home, safety was uncertain. Parents were often exhausted, overworked, pressed by survival. Discipline was harsh, not out of cruelty, but necessity. A child who did not listen could threaten the entire household. So lessons were enforced strictly. For girls, obedience was valued above all else. A good daughter was quiet, helpful, invisible. Praise was rare. Silence was expected. And so, many girls learned to observe rather than speak. Education came through repetition. How to knead dough until arms ached. How to carry weight without complaint. How to anticipate needs before they were spoken. These skills were survival tools. They shaped her body and her mind. As she grew older, the work increased. She assisted in the fields, tended animals, cared for younger siblings. There was little distinction between child and adult labor. Her body adapted. Her mind accepted. Illness was common. Cuts became infections. Fevers lingered. Medical care was limited to herbs, prayer, and hope. A girl learned to endure discomfort quietly. Crying did not bring relief. So she learned patience. For many girls, childhood carried an unspoken tension. As her body changed. So did the way others saw her. Attention grew. Rules tightened. She was reminded to stay close, to avoid certain paths, to lower her eyes. Responsibility shifted subtly. If something went wrong, the blame often fell on her. There were no concepts of personal boundaries. A child belonged to her family. Her time, her labor, her body were not considered her own. This understanding settled deeply. Despite the hardships, moments of warmth still existed. Laughter shared with siblings. Stories told by the fire. Festival days filled with color and sound. These moments were brief, but they mattered. They reminded her that joy existed, even if it was rare. In noble households, childhood looked different on the surface. Girls were taught manners, not chores. They learned to sit properly, to speak politely, but freedom was still limited. Their days were closely watched, their futures planned carefully. They too learned restraint. Fear was a quiet companion. Fear of punishment. Fear of illness. Fear of being noticed for the wrong reasons. A medieval girl learned to navigate this. Fear silently. It became part of her. As adolescence approached, her role became clearer. She was no longer seen as a child. She was a future wife. This understanding was never announced. It simply became obvious. Conversations changed. Expectations shifted. Her childhood faded without acknowledgement. By the time a medieval girl reached her early teenage years, she had already learned endurance. She knew how to work through exhaustion, how to remain calm under pressure, how to obey without question. These were not qualities chosen freely. They were learned through survival. Protection was conditional. It depended on usefulness, on obedience, on circumstance. And when protection failed, there was nowhere else to turn. This was childhood in the medieval world. Not a time of innocence, but preparation. Preparation for marriage, for labor, for pain. A slow shaping of body and mind to fit a world that demanded resilience above all else. In the next chapter, we will move into the moment when this preparation becomes reality. A moment when childhood truly ends, not with celebration, but with obligation. The moment of marriage. Marriage did not arrive suddenly. It approached quietly, long before the girl fully understood what it meant. For most medieval women, marriage was not a question of if, but when. And that moment was rarely decided by her. In medieval society, marriage was not built on love. It was built on necessity. Families married to survive, to secure land, to settle debts, to strengthen alliances. A daughter was part of that system. Her future was discussed in rooms she was never invited into. Agreements were made without her presence. Promises were spoken without her consent. By the time she was told, everything was already decided. Often, the girl was very young. 12, 13, sometimes even younger. Her body was considered ready long before her mind was. This was not seen as cruel. It was seen as normal. Life expectancy was short. Time was precious. And so, childhood ended early. The announcement of marriage was rarely dramatic. It came as a simple statement. You will be married soon. No explanation followed. No questions were expected. If fear appeared on her face, It was ignored. If she cried, she was told to be grateful. Marriage meant security. At least that was what she was taught. The man she would marry was often much older, sometimes by a decade, sometimes more. She might have seen him once. She might not have seen him at all. His character was not discussed. His habits were not explained. What mattered was his position, his land, his ability to provide. She was not marrying a person. She was joining a household. Preparation began immediately. Older women instructed her quietly what to expect, how to behave, how to obey. The guidance was practical, not comforting. Marriage was described as duty. As endurance. As something to be accepted, not enjoyed. On the day of the wedding, emotions were tightly controlled. There was ceremony. There were witnesses, but joy was not guaranteed. The bride wore simple clothing, often borrowed, sometimes worn by generations. Before her she stood silently beside a man who felt unfamiliar. Her voice was barely heard. Her consent was assumed. Religion framed the moment. Marriage was presented as sacred, a bond blessed by God. This language softened reality. It turned obligation into virtue, submission into righteousness, and so resistance felt sinful. After the ceremony, the girl left her family behind. Her childhood home was no longer hers. She belonged to her husband's household now. This transition was sudden. One day a daughter, the next a wife. There was no period of adjustment, only expectation. The wedding night was not spoken of openly. It was hinted at, avoided, wrapped in silence. Fear filled the spaces where words were missing. Young bride entered that night unprepared. Her body was expected to respond correctly. Pain was anticipated. Endurance was praised. There was no concept of refusal. Marriage granted permanent access. Her body was no longer private. It was her duty. This understanding settled heavily, but quietly. No one questioned it. In the days that followed, life did not slow. Work resumed immediately. Household duties expanded. New rules replaced old ones. She learned quickly that marriage did not mean rest. It meant more responsibility. If she struggled, she was reminded of her role. A good wife was patient. A good wife was silent. A good wife endured. Praise came only when expectations were met. Pregnancy followed quickly. For many women, it was not optional. A wife was expected to produce heirs. Failure brought suspicion. Blame rested on her body. Not on circumstance. Some marriages were kind, others were not. But kindness was never guaranteed. And protection was uncertain. Woman depended entirely on her husband's temperament. The law offered little help. Family ties were distant now. For noble women, marriage meant isolation. Castles were large, but lonely, surrounded by servants, yet closely watched. Their lives were defined by protocol, their movements restricted. For peasant women, marriage meant survival. Two lives combined to endure hardship. But hardship remained. Marriage did not ease labor. It increased it. Love, when it existed, was rare. It grew slowly. Quietly. Often after years of shared endurance. But it was never expected that marriage was not built for emotional fulfillment. It was built to function. Over time, the girl learned her new identity. She adjusted her behavior, lowered her expectations. She became efficient, capable, resilient, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Marriage reshaped her world. Her name faded. Her role solidified. She was no longer seen as an individual. She was part of something larger, a household, a lineage. Her own desires disappeared quietly. This was the reality of marriage for medieval women. Not romance, not choice, but obligation. A turning point where childhood ended completely and a lifetime of duty began. In the next chapter, we will move deeper into that reality, into the body that was no longer her own, into the expectations placed upon her as a wife and as a mother. Marriage changed many things, but one change mattered more than all the others. Medieval woman's body was no longer considered her own. In truth, it rarely had been. But now, this reality became unavoidable. From the moment she entered marriage, her body was seen as purposeful, not personal. It existed to serve a function. To work, to bear children, to continue a family line. This understanding was never written down. It was simply known. There was no language for personal boundaries. No concept of consent as we understand it today. Marriage itself was considered consent. Permanent, unquestioned. A wife was expected to comply. Silence was assumed. A woman learned quickly that resistance was meaningless. The law favored husbands. Religion reinforced obedience. Family support was distant now, often impossible to return to. Endurance became the safest response. Her body followed a rhythm not of her choosing. Night after night, season after season, fatigue was constant. Privacy did not exist. Pregnancy arrived often, and sometimes relentlessly. There were no reliable ways to prevent it. A woman could spend most of her adult life either pregnant or recovering from childbirth. Her body rarely rested. Each pregnancy carried risk. Pain was expected. Fear was accepted. A death was always nearby. Yet this danger was normalized. It was spoken of calmly, as if it were simply part of womanhood. A wife's worth was closely tied to fertility. If she became pregnant easily, she was praised. If she did not, suspicion followed. Blame settled on her body. Not on fate. Not on illness. On her. Miscarriages were common. They were mourned quietly, if at all. A woman was expected to recover quickly. Emotion was discouraged. Grief was inconvenient. During pregnancy, labor did not stop. She continued working, cooking, cleaning, carrying weight. Rest was a luxury few could afford. Her body showed signs of exhaustion early. Aging came quickly. Pain became familiar. There were no remedies beyond herbs and prayer. No relief beyond endurance. After childbirth, recovery was brief. Sometimes only days, often less. The household demanded her return. The cycle resumed. Her physical experience was rarely discussed openly. There was no education. No preparation. Women learned through suffering, through whispered advice, through observation. Intimacy was not described as connection. It was described as duty, a task to be completed. Pleasure was irrelevant. For many women, it was never mentioned at all. A wife learned to detach dot, to separate her mind from her body dot. This quiet dissociation became survival, a way to endure what could not be changed dot in noble households. Conditions were different, but control remained. A noble woman's body was carefully monitored, her pregnancies documented, her health observed, but autonomy was still absent. She existed to produce heirs. Her success was measured accordingly. Failure had consequences. A woman who could not produce children risked isolation, replacement dot, or abandonment. Widely accepted beliefs blamed women for complications, illness, infertility, stillbirth. Medical understanding was limited. Superstition filled the gaps. A woman's pain was often dismissed. It was expected, accepted, normalized. Despite this, women supported one another quietly. Midwives, mothers, sisters. They shared knowledge discreetly. They comforted where they could. These moments of solidarity mattered, but ultimately, the system remained unchanged. A woman's body served others. Her needs came last, if they were considered at all. As years passed, her relationship with her body changed. It became something she managed. Endured. Accepted. Not something she owned. Strength was measured in silence. In survival. In continuing despite exhaustion. This was the physical reality of medieval womanhood. A body shaped by expectation, controlled by others. Used until it could no longer give. In the next chapter, we will step closer to the most dangerous moment in a woman's life. Childbirth. A moment faced again and again, with courage born not of choice, but of necessity. In the medieval world, childbirth was not a celebration. It was an expectation, and beneath that expectation lived quiet fear. For a woman, every pregnancy carried the same question, one that was rarely spoken aloud. Would she survive this time? There were no hospitals, no trained doctors waiting nearby. Birth took place at home, in dim rooms warmed by fire, and hope dawned when labor began. Women gathered, mothers, neighbors, midwives, men waited outside. Prayer filled the space where medicine could not. Pain was expected. There were no methods to reduce it. No clear understanding of what caused complications. A woman endured what came, guided by tradition rather than science. Hours passed slowly, sometimes days. Childbirth was dangerous for everyone involved. Infections were common. Bleeding was feared. Complications were poorly understood. Even experienced midwives could do little when something went wrong. They relied on herbs, positioning, and prayer. Often, it was not enough. Death during childbirth was not rare. It was accepted as part of life. Women spoke of it calmly, as if preparing themselves. Each pregnancy carried the memory of others who did not survive. Friends, sisters, neighbors. Loss was familiar. A woman approached childbirth knowing the risks, but refusal was not an option. Her role required it. Her family depended on it. Her value was tied to it. If a woman died during childbirth, her death was mourned briefly. Life continued. The household still needed labor. Children still needed care. Another woman often took her place. This was not cruelty. It was survival. If the child survived and the mother did not, the birth was still considered a success. An heir had been produced. The family line continued. This belief shaped everything. Surviving childbirth did not mean safety. Recovery was short, often only days, sometimes hours. A woman was expected to return to work quickly. Rest was dangerous. There were mouths to feed. Complications lingered. Infections weakened bodies. Pain remained untreated. Some women never fully recovered. They carried injuries quietly for the rest of their lives. Stillbirths were common. They were spoken of softly. As God's will. As fate. Mothers were expected to endure grief silently. To try again. There was no understanding of mental trauma. Fear was normalized. Anxiety was unseen. A woman learned to carry her worry quietly. Midwives played a crucial role. They were respected. Trusted. Feared. Sometimes they held knowledge passed through generations. Not written. Remembered. Despite their importance, midwives were vulnerable. If too many births ended in tragedy, suspicion followed. Later, in darker times, some would be accused of witchcraft. But in this moment, they were all women had. For noble women, childbirth occurred in guarded rooms, attended by many, watched carefully. But danger remained the same. Luxury did not protect against infection. Titles did not stop bleeding. Some women faced repeated pregnancies with little rest. Their bodies weakened over time. Each birth became more dangerous than the last. Still, expectations did not change. Fear became routine, a quiet companion. Women did not speak of it openly, but it was there. In the silence. Before labor. In the prayers, whispered at night. Survival was not guaranteed, but endurance was admired. A woman who survived many births was considered strong, even heroic, yet her suffering remained invisible. Children grew up knowing this risk. Daughters watched mothers carefully. They absorbed the truth without explanation. One day, this would be their experience too. Despite everything, life continued. Women laughed, worked, loved. They carried joy alongside fear. This balance defined medieval womanhood. Childbirth was not a single moment. It was a repeated trial, faced again and again. With courage born not of choice, but of necessity. This was the quiet danger every woman lived with. Not dramatic. Not sudden, but constant. In the next chapter, we will move beyond the birthing room. Into the endless labor that filled the days between pregnancies, work that never truly ended. In the medieval world, rest was temporary. For women, it was rare. Work did not begin with marriage, and it did not pause for pregnancy. It did not end with illness, and it did not disappear with age. Work was constant. A medieval woman's day began before sunrise, often before the birds stirred. She rose quietly, careful not to waste energy. The air was cold. The floor beneath her feet was hard. There was no time to linger. The fire needed attention. Water needed to be carried. Food needed to be prepared. Morning arrived with responsibility. The tasks were repetitive, grinding grain by hand, kneading dough until arms ached, sweeping floors that never stayed clean. Each movement was learned through repetition. There were no shortcuts, only endurance. In rural households, labor extended beyond the home. Women worked in the fields, planting, harvesting, tending animals. They bent under the weight of baskets. They worked through cold and heat alike. The land did not wait. This labor was not considered remarkable. It was expected. A woman's contribution was assumed, not acknowledged. If she worked well, nothing was said. If she failed, it was noticed. Meals were simple, often small. Women ate last, not by rule, but by habit. They ensured others were fed first. Children, husbands, elders. Their own hunger became familiar. Clothing was made by hand, spun, sewn, repaired again and again. Torn garment meant more work. There was no replacement. Everything was reused. Illness did not excuse labor. A fever might slow her movements, but it did not remove expectations. Pain was managed. Quietly. Complaints were discouraged. Woman learned to work through discomfort. There was no separation between home and labor. The home was the workplace. Every corner carried responsibility. There was no moment when the workday clearly ended. Only exhaustion marked the passing of time. Childcare was constant. Infants were carried while working. Toddlers followed closely. Older children were given tasks early. Toddlers followed closely. Older children were given tasks early. Older children were given tasks early. Toddlers follows. Mother worked while teaching others to work. Sleep came late, often interrupted. A woman slept lightly, always listening for a crying child, for a fire dying, for danger. Rest was fragile. In towns, women worked as well. They assisted in shops, prepared goods, sold items in markets. Yet their labor was often unpaid. It belonged to husbands or families. Recognition was rare. Widows and unmarried women worked harder still. Without male protection, they depended entirely on their labor. The margin for error was small. One bad season could mean starvation. For noble women, labor looked different. They managed households, oversaw servants, organized supplies. Their work was less physical, but constant. Responsibility followed them everywhere. Even in wealth, leisure was limited. A noble woman was expected to remain productive. Idleness was discouraged. Duty filled the hours. There were no days off. No concept of weekends. Religious holidays offered brief pauses, but work resumed immediately. Life moved forward relentlessly. As years passed, the toll became visible. Hands roughened, posture bent, strength faded, yet expectations remained. Aging did not reduce responsibility. Older women often became caretakers. Of grandchildren, of the sick, of the dying. Their labor shifted, but did not disappear. Despite exhaustion, women formed quiet bonds. Shared work created connection. Conversation flowed softly while hands moved. These moments mattered. They provided relief. Songs were sung quietly. Stories were shared. Small comforts softened long days. But ultimately, the work was endless. There was no finish line, only continuation. A medieval woman did not work for recognition. She worked to survive. To keep others alive. To ensure tomorrow came. This labor was invisible to history. Chroniclers wrote of battles and kings. They did not write of women. grinding grain in the dark. Yet without this work, nothing else could exist. Her life was shaped by effort, measured not in achievement, but in endurance. She did not stop, because stopping was not an option. This was the rhythm of her days. Work upon waking, work through exhaustion, work until sleep. And then, again. In the next chapter, we will look at another force that shaped her life. Faith. A source of comfort and control. Faith was everywhere in the medieval world. It shaped time. It shaped thought. It shaped behavior. For women, faith was both comfort and constraint. The church stood at the center of daily life. Its bells marked the hours. Its teachings explained suffering. In a world filled with uncertainty, faith offered meaning, but it also offered rules. From childhood, girls learned religious lessons, not through debate, but through repetition. They were taught to obey, to submit, to accept. Virtue was closely tied to silence. Women were often portrayed as morally fragile, closer to temptation, more easily led astray. These ideas were not always spoken harshly. They were spoken calmly. As truth. Stories from Scripture shaped identity. Eve's disobedience. Original sin. Women were reminded of these stories often, not to punish, but to instruct. A woman learned that her role was humility. To endure suffering patiently, to serve without complaint. Pain was seen as meaningful, endurance as virtue. The church offered solace. Prayer provided comfort. In moments of fear or loss. Faith gave language to grief. And allowed women to hope quietly. But faith also justified limitation. A woman's place was defined by doctrine. Leadership belonged to men. Authority belonged to men. Women were encouraged to remain unseen. Religious spaces reflected this order. Men stood closer to the altar. Women remained in the back. Their voices were softer. Their presence smaller. Marriage was sanctified by religion. Obedience became holy. Resistance became sinful. This framing made duty feel unavoidable. For women who questioned their roles, faith offered no answers. Doubt was discouraged. Acceptance was praised. Monasteries provided an alternative. For a few, a life of prayer. Some women found freedom there. Education, community, but access was limited. And even within monasteries, authority remained male. Many women turned to personal devotion, private prayer, quiet rituals. These moments allowed reflection, sense of inner life. Faith was not always imposed. It was internalized. Women believed deeply. Their devotion was sincere, but sincerity did not bring equality. Illness was often seen as divine testing. Childbirth, pain as punishment. Loss as God's will. These interpretations discouraged questioning. A woman learned to accept suffering with grace. To remain silent. To trust that reward existed beyond this life. Religious imagery reinforced obedience. Saints who endured pain quietly. Martyrs who accepted death. These examples shaped expectation. At times, faith empowered women. It gave them purpose. It gave them identity beyond labor, but it never fully freed them. Those who stepped outside accepted roles risk. Judgment, a woman who spoke too boldly, who lived alone, who practiced healing. These women drew suspicion. Faith could turn quickly into fear. Later centuries would see witch hunts. But even before that, unease existed. Women who knew too much were unsettling. Faith drew boundaries. It defined what was acceptable. What was dangerous. Women learned to stay within these lines. Despite restriction, women formed spiritual communities. They prayed together, shared comfort. Faith became connection. For many women, belief was deeply personal, a source of strength. A way to survive. But faith also reinforced the world as it was, a world where women obeyed. Endured. Waited. This dual nature defined medieval religion. Comfort and control. Hope and limitation. As the day ended, women knelt in prayer. They asked for protection, for strength, for endurance, rarely for change. Faith did not promise a better life. Now. It promised meaning later. In the next chapter, we will explore what happened when fear replaced faith. When women were no longer just obedient, but feared. For centuries, women were expected to be quiet. Invisible. Obedient. But there were moments in medieval history when silence was not enough. Moments when women were no longer ignored, but feared. Fear did not arrive suddenly. It grew slowly, fed by uncertainty. Illness without explanation. Crops failing without warning. Children falling sick overnight. In a world without science, fear searched for meaning. And often, it found women. Women lived close to life's fragile edges. They cared for the sick. They assisted in childbirth. They prepared the dead for burial. They handled blood, pain, and loss. This proximity gave them knowledge. And knowledge, in fearful times, felt dangerous. Midwives were respected and watched. They knew which herbs eased pain, which plants stopped bleeding, which teas calmed fever. Their wisdom was passed quietly, from woman to woman, not written. Remembered. When births went well, midwives were praised. When something went wrong, questions followed. Why did the baby die? Why did the mother weaken? Answers were demanded, and fear wanted certainty. Single women drew attention. Widows living alone. Women without family protection. They did not fit neatly into the social order. Their independence felt unsettling. Healers were viewed with suspicion. A woman who understood herbs, who spoke confidently, who lived outside male control. She stood apart. And standing apart was dangerous. Religious belief shaped this fear. Women were already associated with temptation, with weakness. With sin. It did not take much to shift perception from obedient to threatening. Rumors traveled quietly, whispered at markets, murmured near churches. She knows too much. She lives strangely. She doesn't fear men. These words carried weight. As fear grew, stories followed, tales of curses, of evil intentions. Women were blamed for misfortune, not openly at first. But subtly. Accusations rarely required proof. Suspicion was enough. A difficult personality, an argument with a neighbor, a life lived alone. These details became evidence. Once labeled dangerous, a woman's fate became uncertain. Community protection vanished. Trust dissolved. Witch trials did not begin everywhere at once. They emerged in times of crisis, periods of hunger, disease, social instability. Fear demanded control. Interrogations were harsh. Confessions were expected. Truth did not matter. Resolution did. Women accused of witchcraft often confessed to end suffering. Their words were shaped by what questioners wanted to hear. Stories grew more elaborate. Fear fed itself. Most accused were not powerful. They were ordinary. Poor, older, unprotected, easy targets. Men were accused too, but women were the majority. The pattern was clear. Fear followed vulnerability. Communities participated. Neighbors testified. Old disagreements resurfaced. Personal conflicts gained dangerous meaning. The process was often public. Warning: obedience restored through terror. For women watching from the sidelines, the message was unmistakable. Do not stand out. Do not speak boldly. Do not live alone. Knowledge became something to hide. Wisdom was softened. Confidence quieted. Survival meant conformity. Not all regions experienced witch hunts equally, but the fear spread widely. It left a lasting impression. Even women who were never accused felt its weight. They measured their words, their actions. Their presence. This fear reshaped behavior. Women withdrew. They learned invisibility. Again. Faith, once comfort, now mixed with terror. God was not only protector, he was judge. Despite this, women continued to care for one another. Quietly. Discreetly. Support did not vanish. It adapted. The era of fear did not last forever, but its effects lingered. Suspicion became memory. Memory became warning. History remembers witch trials as moments of cruelty, but for women living then, they were lessons. Lessons in silence. Lessons in survival. Fear reminded women that protection was conditional, acceptance fragile, and so they returned to quiet endurance, not because fear defeated them, but because it taught them caution. In the next chapter, we will look at what happened when a woman outlived her role, when age brought neither respect nor safety, only uncertainty. For some medieval women, freedom arrived quietly, not through choice, not through rebellion, but through loss. Widowhood marked a turning point in a woman's life. It removed one form of control and replaced it with uncertainty. When a husband died, a woman's identity shifted. Overnight. She was no longer a wife. She was a widow. This change brought a strange mixture of fear and possibility. In some cases, a widow gained limited independence. She could manage property, oversee finances, make small decisions without male supervision. These moments were rare, but they mattered. For the first time, some women experienced autonomy. They spoke for themselves, negotiated directly, controlled their daily routines. This freedom felt unfamiliar and fragile. Widowhood did not erase danger. It changed its shape. A woman without a husband stood exposed. Protection weakened. Her position depended on age, wealth, and family support. Young widows were watched closely. Their fertility made them valuable. Families moved quickly to arrange remarriage. Choice was still. Limited. Freedom was temporary. Older widows faced different challenges. Without children or resources, they risked poverty. Work became survival. Community support varied. Property rights were inconsistent. Some women inherited land. Others were stripped of everything. Local customs determined fate. Fairness was rare. A widow's independence could provoke resentment. Neighbors questioned her authority. Men challenged her decisions. Her competence unsettled. Expectations. Remarriage was encouraged. A widow who remained single drew attention. Suspicion. Judgment. For noble widows, life could be isolating. They managed estates, oversaw servants, yet they remained constrained by social rules. Their behavior was watched carefully. In some cases, widows chose not to remarry. They valued autonomy over security. This choice required strength. And risk. Widowhood brought grief, but grief was rarely expressed openly. A woman was expected to endure quietly. Life moved forward. Despite loss. Some widows found community. They supported one another, shared knowledge, offered protection. Religion offered guidance. Widows were encouraged to be modest. Devoted. Invisible. Their clothing reflected this role. Darker colors, simple dress. Grief became identity. For many women, widowhood was brief. Remarriage followed. Life returned to familiar patterns. For others, it marked a long, uncertain chapter. They navigated a world without guaranteed protection. Every decision carried risk. Freedom, when it appeared, was conditional. Limited. Easily taken away. A widow learned caution. She balanced independence with invisibility, strength with humility. This balance defined her survival. Too bold, she risked punishment. Too quiet, she risked neglect. Widowhood revealed an important truth. Freedom existed, but only within narrow boundaries. For medieval women, independence was never secure. It depended on circumstance, on tolerance, on silence. Yet, even this fragile freedom mattered. It showed that another life was possible, even if only briefly. In the next chapter, we will look at what happened as women aged, when beauty faded. When labor slowed. And society's patience ended. Aging arrived, quietly for medieval women. There was no moment when it was announced. No ceremony. No recognition. One day, she simply noticed that the world looked at her differently. Her body changed. Strength faded slowly. Pain lingered longer. The work did not stop, but it became heavier. Each task required more effort. Rest, still, was rare. In medieval society, a woman's value was closely tied to usefulness. To labor, to fertility, to service. As these faded, so did attention. An older woman was no longer a bride, no longer a mother of young children. Her role became uncertain. Wrinkles were not symbols of wisdom. They were reminders that her most valuable years had passed. For women with families, aging brought new responsibilities. They cared for grandchildren. They advised younger women. Their knowledge mattered quietly, but authority rarely followed. For women without family support, aging was dangerous. Work slowed. Opportunities disappeared. Poverty crept closer. There was no retirement. No safety net. A woman worked as long as her body allowed. And when it no longer did, she endured. Illness increased with age. Joint pain, weakness, poor eyesight. Medical care remained limited. Herbs, prayer, hope. Older women were often dismissed, their complaints ignored, pain normalized. Some became dependent on charity. Church aid, community kindness. This support was unpredictable. Loneliness followed many women into old age. Husbands died. Children moved on. The household grew quieter. An older woman learned invisibility again. She spoke less, moved carefully, took up little space. Yet older women held memory. They remembered births, deaths, hard winters. They carried stories. Their knowledge was practical. How to survive famine, how to ease pain, how to endure loss. But this wisdom was rarely recorded. Some older women were respected. Others were feared. Especially those who lived alone. An aging woman without protection drew suspicion. She did not fit expectations. She no longer served obvious purpose. In difficult times, fear returned, and older women were vulnerable to it. Despite this, many women continued quietly. They helped where they could, watched children, prepared simple meals. Faith offered comfort, the promise of rest beyond this life, a place where suffering ended. Older women often became deeply spiritual. Prayer filled long hours. Faith softened isolation. Death was familiar. It was not feared loudly. It was accepted. As another stage. An older woman prepared quietly. She passed on belongings. Shared advice. Let go. History rarely mentions these final years. They leave little trace. No achievements. No records. Yet these women remained essential. They connected generations. They preserved knowledge. They carried continuity. Aging revealed the truth of medieval womanhood. Worth was conditional. Protection temporary. Still, endurance remained, even when unnoticed, even when forgotten. This was old age for medieval. Women. Not honored. Not celebrated. But lived. Quietly. In the next chapter, we will look at something different. The small, quiet ways women resisted, not with rebellion, but with persistence. Most medieval women did not rebel. They did not march. They did not shout. They did not challenge the world openly. Their resistance was quieter, almost invisible. In a world that limited their choices, survival itself became an act of strength. Each day required endurance. And within that endurance, women found small spaces of control. Resistance did not always look like defiance. Sometimes it looked like patience. Sometimes it looked like adaptation. A woman learned when to speak, and when silence was safer, this knowledge was passed quietly. Mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. In the household, women controlled routines. They decided how food was prepared, how resources were stretched. Small decisions shaped daily life. They shared knowledge that men rarely noticed. How to preserve grain, how to soothe a fever, how to calm fear. These skills kept families alive. storytelling became a form of resistance. Stories carried warnings, lessons, hidden truths, told softly by FIRIGHT. Songs passed down through generations. Simple melodies. They held memory. They preserved identity. Some women delayed obedience. They moved slowly, asked questions, created space. Others used kindness strategically. Soft words, careful gestures, a way to influence without confrontation. Midwives held quiet authority. They understood bodies. Birth. Death. Their knowledge existed outside written law. This made them powerful. And vulnerable. Women supported one another, shared labor, shared grief, shared silence. Community bonds offered protection. When formal systems failed, resistance also lived in endurance, continuing despite hardship. Raising children in difficult conditions. Finding joy in small moments. A woman protected her inner world. Thoughts. Beliefs. Hope. These could not be taken. Faith provided refuge. Prayer offered strength. Not submission, but survival. Some women resisted by choosing not to speak. Not to explain. Not to justify. Silence became shield. Others resisted through memory, remembering wrongs, learning patterns, avoiding danger. Even laughter mattered. Shared quietly. A moment of humanity. Resistance was not about changing the system. It was about living within it. Without breaking. These small acts did not appear in records. They left no documents. Monuments. Yet they shaped lives. Families survived because of them. Communities endured. Quiet resistance was cumulative. One act alone was small, but together they formed resilience. This resilience defined medieval women. More than suffering, more than obedience. They adapted. They endured. They continued. These women were not powerless. Their power was simply unseen. In the final chapter, we will reflect on what remains. How these lives echo into the present, and why their stories still matter. When medieval women died, they rarely left written words. No journals, no memoirs, no official histories, and yet they left something behind. They left lives that shaped the world quietly, lives that rarely asked for attention. Lives that endured. History often remembers kings, wars, laws, dates, but history also rests on ordinary days, and it was women who carried those days forward. They raised children in uncertain times. They kept households running during famine, war, and illness. They worked through exhaustion. Medieval women built continuity. They connected one generation to the next without recognition. Their labor was constant. Cooking, cleaning, mending, caring, work that never ended. These tasks did not earn praise, but without them, society would have collapsed. Women preserved culture. Through stories. Songs. Traditions passed by voice, not ink. They remembered family histories. Who lived, who died, who mattered. Memory itself became inheritance. They shaped morality quietly, through example. Through patience, through endurance. Even suffering left an imprint. It taught caution. It taught resilience. It taught adaptation. The world medieval women lived in was harsh. Rules were strict. Choices were narrow. Freedom was fragile. Yet within those limits, women lived fully. They laughed when they could love deeply, grieved honestly. They formed bonds that sustained them. Friendships. Family ties. Shared. Survival. Some resisted openly. Most resisted quietly. Both mattered. What medieval women left behind is not found in monuments. It is found in continuity. In the fact that families endured. Communities survived. Life went on. Their strength was not dramatic. It was persistent. Even when their bodies were exhausted, they continued. Even when unseen, they mattered. Modern life is different. But the echoes remain. In expectations placed on women. In labor that goes unnoticed. In resilience. Learned early. Understanding medieval women helps us understand. Now, not to romanticize suffering, but to recognize endurance. Their lives remind us that history is not only shaped by power, it is shaped by persistence. By showing up every day. Despite hardship. Despite silence. These women were not weak. They were constrained and still. They endured. As we reach the end of this story, there is no dramatic conclusion. No final triumph. No revolution. Only acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of lives lived quietly. Of strength that did not announce itself. Of women who carried the weight of their world. Their legacy is not written loudly. It is felt. And now, as this story comes to rest, you can allow these thoughts to fade gently. There is nothing left to remember. Nothing to hold. Nothing to solve. Only quiet. Let the past drift away. Let the voices soften. Let the story end. You are safe. You can rest now.